One of the hard things about the Bible is that sometimes it is filled with sayings and events that seem so far removed from our day-to-day lives. For example, if I had gone back just a few verses from today's text, we find Jesus talking to his disciples. He alluded to these comments at the beginning of today's text, but we find him talking to his disciples, and he says this: "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will save it. What does it profit them if they gain the whole world but lose or forfeit themselves?" Now, I am guessing that if you have been around church very much at all over the years, you have probably heard those words of Jesus before. They are sometimes considered among the most favorite of his many sayings. But just because we know them doesn't mean that they are exactly easy to hear. In fact, I would say that they're not all that easy to hear, and that is because his words here sound so different from the words of our world. The words that our world and our society speak to us every day. We really don't have anything to compare these words to. After all, think about what the world says to us. When the world speaks to us, it usually has a lot to do with getting ahead, of getting what we want and getting it when we want it. We are taught by so many voices in our world that the point in life is safety and security, stability and success. But then along comes Jesus. Then along comes Jesus, and he offers up words that fly in the face of worldly wisdom. Jesus gives us words about sacrifice, about self-denial, words about cross-bearing, and losing our lives for Jesus' sake. These words are so different, so startlingly and frighteningly different from the words of the world that it's hard to almost know what to do with them. To what can we compare these words of Jesus? We could look at some of the events in the Bible and see that they are kind of removed from our day-to-day lives as well. Take, for example, our first text today, the story about Moses. Moses had been up there on the mountaintop, much like the disciples in our other text. He had been up there on that mountaintop and he had been talking with God. But when he came down bearing the 2 tablets of the covenant, his face was shining because he had been in the very presence of God. The people were afraid. They were so afraid that Moses had to put a veil over his face to hide the glow from his encounter with God. But how does that experience resonate with our own day-to-day lives? There's really no comparison, is there? Well, what about the story of Paul? I didn't read that one today, but you all know the story of Paul, or Saul as he was known then. He was on his way up to Damascus. His mission was to wipe out the church. And the book of Acts tells us that he was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. But as he made his way, he was suddenly blinded by a brilliant light. And he fell to the ground, and he heard the voice of Jesus himself, who asked him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And Paul would go on to become the greatest missionary in the history of the church. He would eventually go and give his life for Christ. But has anything like that ever happened to us? We have no comparison to these things. I remember when I was taking my first tentative steps toward entering the ministry, I was a member of Central Presbyterian Church in Anderson, South Carolina. And I went to see our minister at the time, a guy named John LaHoop. And I talked to him about it. I talked to him about what I was feeling and what I was going through and how I thought that maybe I was being called to the ministry. But I just wasn't sure. And one of the things I told John was this. I can't put my finger on it, but I guess I am waiting on some kind of Damascus Road experience like Paul had. But I haven't had one. No Damascus Road experience. No bright lights. No voices from God telling me what to do. That's what I told John. And I remember we sat there in silence for probably about 30 seconds. And then he looked at me and he said, "Good. I would have been worried about you had you had all those things." You see, I had no Damascus Road experience on my way to the ministry. And as I would ultimately find out, neither have most of the ministers I know. In fact, I would go so far, at least in our Presbyterian types, not even most of the Christians I know have had something like that in their life. And that, I suppose, is what makes these words of Jesus and these events and experiences we read about in the Bible sometimes so strange and foreign to us. We simply don't live in a world where we have anything to compare them to. And then there's today's text. I'm guessing that none of us have experienced anything like Peter, James, and John do in our passage from Luke. They went up the mountain, the text tells us, to pray. But they got far more than they bargained for. This text, by the way, is known as the Transfiguration story. Today is Transfiguration Sunday. Because here in a moment, Jesus is changed. His face is different. His clothes turn into a dazzling white. And Moses and Elijah appear to him. And a cloud descends upon the mountain. And the three terrified disciples hear the very voice of God say, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And then, as quickly as it started, it was all over. And they were left there alone on the mountaintop with Jesus. There's really nothing in our experience like that, is there? So when we read about these events in the Bible, what do we do with them? What are we going to do with texts like this? As one of my professors at Princeton, David Willis, once remarked to me, "Well, it's in the Bible, so you better figure out what you're going to do with it." And that's what I want to do today. Figure out how to deal with these strange words, these strange events. I want to figure out how to deal with what Karl Barth called the strange new world of the Bible. And to do that, I want to start with us. But I do so by admitting that doing so exposes the problem itself. You see, most of us approach the Bible with questions like these. What does this text have to do with me? What does this passage have to say to me right now? Here, in this place, in my day-to-day life? What does it have to say to me or about me? Now, did you know something about all of those questions? They all had a pretty prominent pronoun. Me. I suppose it's not surprising that we do that. After all, as we have already talked about, the world we live in encourages us to ask these type of questions. To look out for number one, to ask what's in it for me. But here's a question. What if the Bible isn't about us? What if the Bible isn't about us? What if instead the Bible is about God? What if the Bible is about what God has done, what God is doing, and what God will do through Jesus Christ? Whenever we approach a text and assume that it is about us and what we can get out of it, there's a risk there of watering that text down, of softening it, and making it a little more palatable and easy to follow. Take that one about bearing crosses. I hear people say something all the time. Well, I guess dealing with Aunt Edna is my cross to bear. I don't think that's what Jesus was after. But if the Bible is instead about God, then we run an even greater risk when we try to make it be about us. Because we also run the risk of watering God down, of making God a little easier to take, making God a little easier to grasp and understand. And then what we end up with is a nice, safe, and manageable God. Oh, a God who maybe will swoop in sometimes when we need something. That's, we don't mind that. Or a God who will intervene when we want something. We're okay with that. But otherwise, God, you can just leave us alone and let me go on my merry way, right? Let me live the kind of life the world tells me, God. I'll call you when I need you. In other words, we end up with a God that is not very much of a God at all. My friends, that is not the God of the Bible. And that is not the God of today's text. When we take out our Bibles and we open them up and read a text, the first question we should ask is, what does this passage reveal about God? And if we were to begin with that question, then we do indeed enter a strange new world. A world where God lives and reigns. We encounter a God who is not some watered-down concoction of our own fragile psyches, but the powerful and wonderful and awe-inspiring Holy One of Israel who has loved us by coming into the world as Jesus Christ. Now, in the text today, the disciples are supposed to learn this, though we wonder if they and we do. When the cloud descends and God's voice is heard, it's not about some incredible spiritual experience that the disciples have and we lack. It is rather about this. It is about God's pronouncement, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." Listen to him. Friends, this text is about God. It is about who God is in Jesus Christ. It's not about us. Here is God's statement that Jesus is not just another itinerant preacher, not just some wandering rabbi or cynic sage, as some would have him be. Jesus is not just our friend and companion. Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, the one through whom the world was born, the one through whom the world is saved, and the one through whom at the end God's purposes will be fulfilled. Now, that might make us a little bit uncomfortable. After all, Peter, James, and John are left terrified in this text, right? And if it makes us a little bit uncomfortable, you know what? That's okay. Maybe sometimes we should be a little bit uncomfortable when we encounter God, when we enter into God's presence. For we have encountered something, or rather someone, that is far greater and more powerful and more gracious and more loving than anything our feeble and fallen minds and souls could ever make up on their own. Yes, there is mystery here. There is awe and wonder here. And that is as it should be when we encounter God. We need a God who is greater than anything we know here in this world. After all, when we look around the world that is around us, there is an awful lot of bad news out there. There is sickness and pain. There is suffering and grief. The world is filled with all of these things. And sooner or later, all of us will experience these things as well. And it is right there. It is right there in those moments when we encounter the pain and the grief and the suffering and the sorrow of the world that I am so grateful that we worship a God who is far bigger and far greater and far more wonderful than anything that is found in this busted up and pain-filled world in which we live. God is greater than anything the world can throw at us. God only knows we need a God like that just to get us through what we find in this world. So, to what can we compare this? The answer is nothing. Nothing. For there is nothing else on heaven and earth that compares to the God we find in Jesus Christ. And for that, we should give thanks to God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.